you ever wondered what creepy creatures were left out when Noah's Ark closed its doors? Today, we're going to uncover 10 monsters so terrifying and unknown that, for some reason, they weren't allowed aboard the Ark. How dangerous were they? Stay until the end, because the last creature might blow your mind with fear. We begin with the Stone Colossus. This monstrosity, according to legends passed down through the ages, was made of pure rock, its body covered by a thick layer of green moss and vines that wrapped around it as if nature itself had claimed it. Its massive and imposing figure towered over the tallest trees in the forests, and when it walked, the ground trembled under its immense weight, as if the earth itself feared its steps. An ancient being, it was a guardian of mountains and hidden valleys, destined to protect the land and its darkest secrets. Its stone skin was not just a natural armor, but a symbol of its indestructible connection to the world. However, its soul was bound to the very earth it protected. Every step it took brought it closer to an irreversible fate. If it tried to stray too far from the mountains that formed it, its body would begin to crumble, turning to dust, as if the earth was reclaiming its existence. Even the overwhelming power of the flood would have been its end. Thus, the Colossus could never approach the Ark, as its form was too fragile outside its domain. Its destiny was sealed among the mountains, where its titanic figure would remain forever, with no place on Noah's refuge. Next we have the Faceless Wanderer, a humanoid figure whose presence chilled the blood of anyone who encountered it. Accounts vary, but all agree on the overwhelming terror that gripped those who dared to describe it. It had no visible features. Its face was simply a blank stretch of skin, smooth and opaque, where eyes, a nose, or a mouth should have been. However, its eyes, those were a horrifying anomaly. Two deep voids, like infinite black wells that absorbed all the light around them. Those who dared to stare into them were said to disappear without a trace, as if their very souls had been consumed by those dark eyes, doomed to wander an eternal void. There was no escaping its gaze, no matter how pure the intent to flee. Was it a demon? A manifestation of pure evil? A lost soul trapped in a lifeless body? Or something far darker and more ancient? No one could give a definitive answer, but all agreed on one thing. The Faceless Wanderer was such an incomprehensibly malevolent entity that it had no place on Noah's Ark. The refuge of humanity could not harbor a being whose very existence seemed to bring chaos and disappearance, as any presence like its own could only bring destruction. The Stalking Shadow emerges only on moonless nights when the darkness is at its heaviest, and the stars seem to hide in the sky. It moves among the shadows with terrifying grace, as if the darkness itself had birthed it. Its body blends so completely with the night that it is nearly impossible to distinguish it from the surrounding shadows. There is no sound when it moves, no snapping branches underfoot, no whisper of the wind, just an absolute void, as if nature itself ceased to exist in its presence. And as it approaches, everything around it grows cold, a deadly chill that freezes the soul and paralyzes its victims. The Stalking Shadow was said to hunt mercilessly, preying on any living being that crossed its path, wrapping them in a darkness so thick they could not escape, no matter how desperately they fought. Once trapped in its embrace, victims simply vanished, consumed by the darkness itself, as if they had never existed. It was a predator of the night, whose sole purpose seemed to be the hunt. Its presence signified imminent death for anyone who couldn't escape in time. Such an unstoppable, lifeless being had no place on Noah's Ark. In humanity's refuge, there was no room for a creature that brought only darkness and death. Next is the Four-Headed Beast, a grotesque and terrifying creature that defied all logic and nature. Its body was a disturbing amalgamation of beast and monster, but its most unsettling feature was the presence of its four heads, each with a distinct personality and purpose. One of its heads screamed incessantly, a harrowing sound that seemed to pierce the minds of all who heard it, filling them with anguish and despair. This head never rested, constantly emitting howls and screams that echoed endlessly through the valleys. The second head, however, whispered ceaselessly, uttering incomprehensible dark secrets filled with an unsettling wisdom. Those who managed to hear its murmurs were driven to madness, as if the creature revealed horrors beyond their understanding. The third head seemed to sleep, its eyes closed and its breathing heavy. But its tranquility was only a facade, as it could awaken at any moment with deadly violence. And the fourth head, the most terrifying of all, simply stared. Its gaze was fixed and penetrating, digging deep into the soul. Anyone who met its eyes could not escape the horror it inflicted. No human dared approach the four-headed beast without meeting a fatal end. Its eyes, its screams, and its whispers created indescribable chaos, disorienting anyone who came too close. Even the animals near the ark felt an aversion to its presence, fearing it instinctively. No living being, not even the bravest, could endure the weight of its terrifying existence. Thus, the four-headed beast never found a place on the ark, a monster so complex and lethal, with chaos incarnate in its very being, could never coexist with the order and peace that Noah's refuge represented. Deep in the forests, where sunlight barely touched the ground, lived the guardian of the forbidden woods. This creature was a gigantic being, a manifestation of nature itself brimming with power and life. Its body was an intricate tangle of branches, leaves, and bark, which seemed to fuse with the trees and the very earth. Instead of arms, it had long branches that stretched toward the sky, covered in moss and lichens, as though they were part of the forest structure. Its bark was as hard as iron, impenetrable to any weapon or attack. The Guardian was an unyielding protector of its domain. Those who dared to enter its forbidden territory, where the flora grew in strange and ancient patterns, were ensnared by its branches, which closed around them like shackles of living wood. Those who succumbed to its power became forever trapped in the forest's essence, becoming part of its eternal world. Its connection to nature was so profound that its very existence was tied to its ancestral forest. If it strayed too far, its strength and vitality would fade, and it would crumble like a fleeting shadow. The Guardian could never be on the ark, as its wild nature and devotion to protecting the forest kept it far from any harmony or refuge. The Earth Snake was a colossal and terrifying creature that slithered across the ground with deadly grace. Her body, covered in dark, dull scales, stretched for miles, sinking into the depths of the earth like a massive living shadow. Every movement she made left behind a trail of venom, a deadly liquid that tainted the soil and air, poisoning everything in her wake. This venom didn't just affect living creatures, but also destroyed vegetation, turning fertile fields into barren wastelands where nothing could grow. Animals that wandered too close fell under her power, dropping dead instantly or succumbing to the toxicity emanating from her body. She wasn't just a gigantic snake, she was a force of destruction, obliterating everything indiscriminately. Her cold, calculating eyes reflected the desolation left in her path, as though her sole purpose was to contaminate and devastate. In a world struggling to stay afloat and preserve life, a creature like the Earth Snake had no place. Her destructive nature was incompatible with the Ark, whose mission was to save life, not destroy it. Among the mountains of ash and ruins, the bone and dust giant was reborn again and again. This creature was no ordinary being of flesh and blood, but an enormous skeletal figure composed of broken bones, shrouded in dust and ashes. Its presence was a harbinger of desolation, a shadow emerging ceaselessly from the remnants of some prior catastrophe. Though it had been defeated time and again, the giant always returned, as if a dark, uncontrollable force resurrected it. No one knew what kind of magic or curse granted it this regenerative ability, but every time it fell, it rose again, more fearsome than before. The haze of dust surrounding it seemed to devour light, enveloping everything nearby in an oppressive and suffocating atmosphere. Its steps made the earth tremble, as though each movement was a reminder that the end of the world was inevitable. There was nothing in its nature that suggested it could coexist with other beings, let alone the animals of the Ark. The bone and dust giant was a manifestation of death and decay, and its presence meant only one thing: destruction. For this reason, it could never find a place within the Ark, a sanctuary for life and hope. Among the shadows of abandoned villages, where the wind whispered through ruined houses and the stars dared not shine, lurked the soul eater of the lost. This specter was a floating entity, an intangible presence that drifted like a shadow through moonless nights. It had no defined shape. Its silhouette was blurry and ever-changing, always shifting, but its most unsettling feature was its gaze. Those who dared look into its eyes felt their very soul begin to detach from their body, as though an invisible force was pulling it away. Ancient texts spoke of a single glance capable of stealing a victim's life force, leaving them completely empty, without will or hope. It was said that the Soul Eater didn't kill its victims immediately, but left them to languish, trapped in a kind of existential void where everything they once were slowly disappeared. Over time, their bodies became empty husks, unable to withstand the passage of time. as their souls had been consumed. This creature was a predator of souls, an entity that thrived in the darkness of forgotten places where no one dared venture. In the Ark, where hope and life were paramount, there was no room for such an entity, which embodied the total annihilation of the self. The Branch Man was one of the most unsettling creatures hiding at the edges of the darkest and most remote forests. His figure was a grotesque mix of man and tree, with a humanoid trunk covered in thick, twisted bark, while his limbs were long tree branches, adorned with dark, shriveled leaves. This creature hunted the unwary who ventured too close, moving with surprising speed among the forest shadows. His appearance was not only terrifying but also deeply unsettling. As he approached his victim, his branches stretched toward them, wrapping them in a deadly embrace. The victims became trapped by the branches, which twisted around them as if they had a will of their own, dragging them toward the trunk of the Branch Man. Once ensnared, the victims were slowly consumed, absorbed into the creature's body, becoming part of him. The terrified screams of travelers quickly faded, smothered by the creak of the branches that ensnared them. Though some dismissed him as mere legend, nearby villagers swore the Branch Man lived to hunt and devour those who dared disrespect the forest's boundaries. In the Ark, where life was to be preserved, there was no place for such a merciless creature that fed on despair and anguish. Finally, we have the Lady of the Deep Shadows, a feminine entity of dark, terrifying beauty, who emerged on the blackest nights, when the moon hid behind clouds, and the sky seemed to swallow all light. Her figure floated gracefully, gliding silently through the air, surrounded by a dense, thick fog as black as the night itself. Legend spoke of her presence as a curse that fell upon the lands she touched. Wherever she appeared, fear gripped the living, as though the very air became heavier, denser, as if the shadows surrounding her could consume the soul of anyone who looked at her. Her gaze was so deep and piercing that those who met it felt as if time itself had stopped, and darkness began to devour everything around them. No one could escape her presence. Some claimed she was the manifestation of fear itself, a being born from the depths of the collective unconscious, the embodiment of despair. When Noah and his family realized she was nearby, they wasted no time slamming the doors of the Ark shut, sealing any chance of the Lady of the Deep Shadows crossing its threshold. For a creature so dark and dangerous, there could be no place in the Ark, a sanctuary for life and hope. These terrifying creatures were left outside as Noah's Ark floated through the floodwaters. But what happened to them once the waters receded? Could they still be lurking in the shadows, forgotten by time? If you want to hear more stories of forgotten creatures, don't miss the next video, and subscribe to the channel, or one of them might come for you tonight.